Okay, with this background about feedbacks in engineering point of view, let's study how what are the sensory feedbacks are involved for human motion control. So one of the typical control required human motion is upright standing because it's inherently unstable posture, inverted pendulum posture. So there are motion sensors involved to measure the movement. Okay, so compared to the other sensational organ, there are specific like organs for the motion capturing, such as vision, vestibular organ, and the muscle spindles, which I'm going to explain later in the slide. And those multi-sensory signals are combined and sent to the brain part. And then based on the integrated sensory information, um, it catches out how our body moves with respect to the environment and then planning the control output. So those control outputs sent to the neuromuscular efferent nerve pathway so that it'll actually trigger or actuate the muscles at each joint so that the muscle can produce the joint torques. So these are big sensory feedback loop, like movements are sensed by the sensory peripheral nervous system, are sent to the brain, the central nervous system, and then based on those motor planning, those motor outputs are sent to the muscle. So it's a kind of closed loop sensory feedback system. And note that all those stimuli, like visual, vestibular, the head movements, or muscle, like a joint angle movements, are basically eventually transferred as a pulse, electrical pulse called the action potential. Depending on the energy intensity, the action potential frequency might vary. So by having those different action potential profiles, our brain make a judgment how our body moves to the environment. Those are the sensory coding. So for the next, we are going to go over a little bit of detail about how vision, vestibular organ, and muscle spindles transfer the movement signals into the electrical signal, like action potential, and then which brain part involved for processing it. Okay, so for the vision, we all know about the vision very well. So not only having the image of it, it also has a movement information. So briefly go over the signal pathway. There are visual field and catches by the lights through the eye, through the eye, and those are transfer the information nerves electrical pulse signal has been generated through the optical nerve here, and then there are some ipsilateral and bilateral transfer, meaning like left eye's neural signal sending to the left part of the brain as well as the right part of the brain. So the very end, this is the part that interpret those pulse information in terms of human motion for the visual information. It's called the primary visual cortex part. So again, so basically the output reaching to the cortex is the electrical pulse. So there should be a relationship between how the input variables like a head movement, head angular velocity are transferred to this action potential, the electrical output signal. So the physiologist experimentally examined how these relationship or the transfer function between the head angular velocity with respect to the neural signals to call the vision afferent signal. Afferent signal means neural signal coming out of the sensor to the brain. So what we obtained here for the rotational vision is about unity transfer function, or very simple first degree responses. So a little bit of delayed and reaches to the constant value. Head translational velocity transfer function has been also examined and then approximated as similar to the angular, so approximately 1. So pretty well matching. Your head movements are matched with the electrical afferent sensory signals. Okay. So if you want to model the sensory integration or sensory information transfer, you can use this transfer function for mathematical formulation. Okay, how about the vestibular organ? Vestibular organ here measures the head acceleration, like by utricle and saccule, and head angular velocity, like a gyroscopic scope roll, like by 3 semicircular canal. The location of the vestibular organ is very next to the cochlea. So those are the vestibular apparatus. And this circular shape, what we call as a semicircular canals. There are 3 semicircular canals, which is measuring the rotational motion about the directions for the rotational direction perpendicular to it. And there are sort of the part that located sort of horizontal and vertical. That's what we call the utricle and saccule, measuring the head acceleration. If we look at the inside of the semicircular canals, they are filled with the fluid, and then the fluid is moving through the canal. And then due to the head rotation, those fluid will move one way or the other. And then in the middle, there is a cupula, looks behave like a valve, okay, like a flexible valve moved by the fluid motion. Will have this suspending motion or deflection. And within the cupula, there are hair cells, okay? A hair cell also makes some displacement. And due to the hair cell displacement, there is an ion channel open, mechanically open, and that all triggers the electrical signal to the nerves. Okay, that's how transformation of the motion stimulus to the nerve signal at the cupula. So the semicircular canals has angular accelerations or angular velocity transfer from the motion to the electrical signal. Otoliths itself are indicating the stone, okay? Oh, wait, by the way, and those semicircular canals have a 3 sort of perpendicular shapes, so each canals are measuring the rotational motion of that specific shape, and 3D canal has located in each ear, so left and right hand side, right ear. And otolith actually itself indicates the stone-like type of stuff located in the utricle and saccule. And then whenever there's a motion occurs for the human head, there is this gelatinous layer moves, okay, back and forth, and then the stone, this otolith, actually add the inertia of it, so it'll enhance the motion for the hair cell. So due to the motion of the hair cell, there's ion channel opens and then generate the nerve signal. So that's also mechanical transfer between the acceleration to the nerve signal occurring at utricle and saccule otolith organs. So basically, the nerve pathways are following nearby the cochlear branch because it's just location is actually next to the cochlea. So the vestibular branch and cochlear branch comes together as a vestibular cochlear nerve. And there is a vestibular nucleus is collecting those signals and then sent through the brain, many part of the brain related about the head motion interpretations like cortex and the cerebellum. And again, this is the simply electrical signal, the pulse signal, the axon potential. So we can also get the relationship between the head acceleration, the input stimulus in terms of relationship between the head movement and the output sensory afferent nerve pulse signal, so that we could obtain the transfer function between the head angular velocity, omega head, to the semicircular afferent signal y semicircular canal. And for the head acceleration input, we can also find out what is otolith afferent signal transfer function. So different from the vision, it looks like this sort of high pass filter, okay, type transfer function can be obtained. Okay, how about the muscle spindle? Before I introduce the muscle spindle, let me briefly talk about the somatic sensation. Somatic sensation may be not familiar to you, but it's a sensation from the whole body, okay? So like a skin, you can get a touch sensor, the pressure, or muscle measures the joint motion and joint angle, joint angular rate, and the bones also measures the pressure, and tendons also measures the motion or the pressure. And then also the skin has a temperature, pain, kind of signals can be measured. That's all what we call the somatic sensation. And among its somatic sensation, there is a muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organ provided the muscle position and stretch information, which called proprioception. So within the muscle, okay, you can see this muscle fiber, and maybe this line means this a sarcomere unit. So inside the muscle, there is spindle-looking kind of organ is the part that senses those muscle position and stretch is called muscle spindle, and also Golgi tendon located about the muscle and tendon connection part that also sends the tension information, and those information sent to the brain through the afferent signal. Okay, so whenever there's a muscle stretches or muscle contracted, those spindle configuration changes, and those changes actually transferred as the nerve signal, so they like action potential. So for the stretch, it has an enhanced action potential frequency, and for the contraction, there's none. Okay, by having those different action potential profile, our brain could interpret the joint position. So we can also do the physiologist could find the relationship between the input versus the output, the transfer function for the muscle spindle. Like for the theta input and the corresponding afferent neural signal output, obtained transfer functions look like this. And still, now there are many physiologists try to examine this relationship, and then you may refer to the article reporting about the new findings about the stimulus and the afferent nerve relationship. Okay, so the final destination for the somatosensations are reaching to the somatosensory cortex part. Okay, so the kind of ring shape, like a peripheral region of the brain called somatosensory cortex interpret the pulse signal as a position for each joint, like a hand, like a wrist position, elbow position, or the knee position, etc. And those sensed informations are next to the primary motor cortex. Motor cortex is the part that generates the muscle activation signal. Okay, it pretty makes sense because you are sensing the motion from the body like a somatosensation, and that actually linked to the motor. By the way, so how those electrical pulse could be interpreted as a motion for the like upper limb or the lower limb, etc. That depends because your brain part is allocated, the nerve interpretation is allocated by the position. So for example, the mid part of your somatosensory cortex are allocated for interpreting the signals as a facial sensation, and sort of upper part of your somatosensory cortex is allocated for the interpretation for the upper limb or the hand. Okay, so as you can see here, the upper limb and hand and face are allocated most of the somatosensory cortex part, right? So that's because your upper limb, including the hand and the face, has a very fine resolution per se of the sensory sensation. So fine discriminations are possible for that part. So you have a larger area brain dedicated to those interpretation of pulse signals as a sensation and motor control as well. So if our bodies are looks like a proportional to the range for the allocated for the somatosensory cortex, we will have a really big hand relative to the torso and the lower limb, and a big face, and especially the mouth and tongue. So that's what we call the sensory homunculus. Okay, all those sensory informations like a vision, vestibular, and the muscle spindle proprioceptions are sent to the central nervous system. So our nervous systems are composed by CNS and the PNS. The CNS, which is called usually the brain, and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord, what we call the central nervous system. And all the others, the remainders, what we call the peripheral. Okay, so the central nervous system, not only the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, cerebellum also plays a great role to maintain a balance and posture control as well, and sensory integration. Okay, so if you're looking at the spinal cord cross section, the spinal cord has a two neural pathway. One is a pathway from the sensor to the brain called efferent, the afferent, sensory afferent neuron pathway on the back part. So this is the body front, okay? Even though, okay, this human figure looking I mean the back side of the figure where we look, but okay, this is spinal, this one is a front side. Okay, and from the brain, there are motor efferent neurons coming out through the ventral part, the front part of the body, the spinal cord, to the muscle fibers. And this is the spinal nerve, what we call the spinal nerve. So collected, our motion is catched by the three sensors: vision, vestibular, and muscle spindles. And all those sensory informations are sent through the sensory afferent neuron to the brain, to the spinal cord. Okay? And then your brain, mainly from the primary motor cortex, planning the control of the muscle, and then send out those neuromuscular signal throughout the spinal cord through the efferent neuron and up to the muscle fiber. Okay, that's the big structure for the sensory input and the motor output. Okay, so let's just briefly summarize the differences and similarities between the engineering and biological sensory feedback control. So similar setup, like we have a plant, like a robot or the vehicle, and then you have an engineering sensor and controller and the actuator. Similarly, we have a plant as a skeletal system of the body, and those are sensed by the motion sensors, and those informations are sent through the nerve to the central nervous system. And those control plans are sent through the central CNS and the PNS. One big difference that I'd like to emphasize here is, as an engineer, the control engineer, we are supposed to design the controller, right? To make this robot, walk like such and such, or the vehicle moving like such and such, we are designing the controller, right? What kind of gain we should pick, what kind of controller, linear, nonlinear control we should pick. That's what our role, the control engineer's role. For biological system, we have to we are identifying the controller. I mean, it's already there. It's really like already controlled very well, right? Our human motion, walking and running, and all the other actions are really well controlled system. So we like to identify how we can quantitatively and qualitatively describe the controller's characteristics. That is done by the human. Okay, so either the controller that we could propose could explain the human behavior, human data, and even could interpret why that specific manner, why that specific controller is used for the human posture or human walking. That would be really beneficial to understand the human motion and its control. Okay, so those are two big differences about engineering perspective and biomechanist perspective. Okay, so with that, we have sort of briefly introduced sensory feedback related mechanism, the physiologies involved for the human motion. And for the next time, I will introduce the actual example with the specific like posture control, balance control.